They handed me an envelope like I was 12 years old, and inside was my own money, measured out like punishment. I'm telling you this from the place I finally reached, calm, clear, and done pretending humiliation is love. 3 weeks after that envelope landed on my kitchen table, my son was staring at a lease deadline with my signature on it, and his wife's lipstick print still on my coffee mug. I know how that sounds. Cold, calculating, like I'd been waiting my whole life to lower a blade. But this wasn't revenge the way people whisper it, messy and loud. It was justice the way grown women learn to do it. Quiet, documented, and impossible to argue with. I'm Evelyn Hart, 68 years old, born with hands that learned work before they learned softness. Nevada is where I became myself. Wide sky, hard sun, and the kind of heat that tells you the truth. I lived here long enough to watch the desert bloom after rare rain, and long enough to bury a man I loved under a sky that didn't flinch. My husband, Tom, died 12 years ago, and I learned grief the way you learn a language you never wanted. Slowly, painfully, and forever. When he left, he didn't leave me helpless. He left me a small paid-off house, a modest retirement, and a son I believed would protect me the way we protected him. That son is Aaron, 42, with Tom's straight posture and my soft eyes when he remembers to look. For most of Aaron's life, I was the steady one, the one who packed lunches, paid bills, and stayed up when fevers ran hot. Tom and I weren't rich, but we were disciplined, and discipline kept our family warm. We taught Aaron that promises are sacred and that the person who pays attention wins. What we didn't teach him, because I didn't know to, was how to recognize control, dressed up as care. The first red flag didn't arrive waving, it arrived smiling. Marissa came into Aaron's life like polished granite, pretty, strong, and unforgiving if you tried to scratch her. She was the kind of woman who called people sweetie, while cutting them down with a sentence that sounded harmless. At dinner, she'd watch who spoke most, who apologized fastest, who looked down when corrected. I noticed it, the way women notice weather changes before the men even feel wind. But I told myself I was being old-fashioned. After Tom died, the house got quieter than I expected. The silence wasn't just sound. It was a physical thing, sitting in corners, filling the hallway, lingering in the empty side of the bed. So when Aaron called 2 summers ago and said, "Mom, we might need to stay with you for a bit," my first emotion wasn't suspicion. It was relief, shameful, and honest, because loneliness can make you generous in ways that aren't wise. They arrived with too many boxes and too much confidence for people who said it was temporary. Marissa walked through my living room like she was reviewing a rental property, tapping the walls with her nails. Aaron hugged me long and tight, and I felt the familiar weight of him, my child grown into a man I still wanted to rescue. The first night, I served iced tea in my favorite chipped mug, the one Tom once teased me for keeping. Marissa held it between 2 fingers like it might stain her, and she said, "Oh, vintage," with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. The mug became the first symbol I didn't recognize as a warning. The second was the spare house key, brass, worn smooth from decades of use, heavy with trust. I had always kept it on a hook by the door, an old habit, because Tom believed in being prepared. When Marissa organized the entryway, that hook disappeared, replaced by a sleek bowl where keys went to die. I remember thinking, it's just decor. Don't be dramatic, because that's what women like me were trained to say to ourselves. 2 weeks after they moved in, Marissa sat me down at my own kitchen table. She had a folder, blue, crisp, and new, set in front of her like a podium, and she wore the kind of calm you see in people who practice being right. Aaron stood behind her, not touching my chair, not standing beside me, just hovering like a person unsure which side of a line he belonged on. Marissa folded her hands and said, "Evelyn, we've been worried about your spending." I blinked once, slow, because I thought I'd misheard her, and then I laughed, small, polite, waiting for the joke to show itself. "There's no joke," she said, still smiling. She slid a paper toward me, a neat chart with categories like groceries, gas, fun, and this one made my throat tighten, miscellaneous. "You're on a fixed income," she continued, "and it's easy at your age to lose track. We just want to make sure you're protected." Aaron finally spoke, but his voice sounded like it came from another room. "Mom, it's not a big deal, it's just structure." I looked down at that chart and saw my life reduced to boxes. I wanted to point out that the bills had always been paid, that I'd never missed a mortgage payment in my life, that this house was mine because I had worked for it. But the moment was slippery, because the accusation wasn't direct enough to fight without seeming defensive. Marissa's eyes held mine like she was waiting for me to protest so she could label it confusion. So I did what so many women do when cornered in their own home. I softened my voice and asked a question instead. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, even though I already knew. Marissa opened the blue folder and pulled out an envelope, thick with cash, and set it on the table. "This is your weekly allowance," she said, like she was describing a chore chart. I felt heat rush into my face, and the room narrowed to the sound of my refrigerator humming behind me. My own son watched, silent, as his wife gave me my money like a favor. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the envelope back at her face, though the urge was sharp and clean. I picked it up, felt the weight of it, and I told myself to stay dignified. Because dignity, at my age, is a weapon you learn to hold steady. And as I stood up, I noticed something small that would matter later. Marissa's phone, face up on the table, showing an open email draft titled Lease Renewal. I didn't understand it yet, but I felt the cold pinch of it in my gut. That night, I washed the chipped mug in silence, and I stared at the crack in the ceramic like it had a message. Something is breaking, I thought, and I hated that the thing breaking might be me. Then I heard Marissa laughing softly in the living room, and the sound had no warmth in it at all. I went to bed with my hands clenched under the sheet, and I promised myself I wouldn't stay confused forever. The next morning, I opened my mailbox and found a letter addressed to Erin and Marissa Hart at my address, welcoming them as primary residents. They didn't start with yelling, they started with corrections. Marissa corrected how I loaded the dishwasher, how I folded towels, how loud I spoke on the phone, as if my habits were messes she inherited. When I bought myself peaches at the grocery store, yellow, soft, smelling like summer, she raised her eyebrows at the receipt. "Peaches are expensive," she said, and tapped my envelope like it was evidence. I remember standing in my kitchen with sticky peach juice on my fingers, feeling like I'd been caught stealing from myself. The first betrayal incident came wrapped as help. Marissa offered to streamline my accounts so nothing falls through the cracks, and Erin nodded along, relieved to hand responsibility to someone else. One afternoon, I tried to order new reading glasses online, and my card declined. I called the bank, embarrassed, and the young man on the line confirmed my daily spending limit had been lowered. When I asked who requested it, he paused, just long enough for my stomach to sink, and said, "It appears an authorized user updated the settings." I confronted Erin gently, because I was still trying to win without war. "Why is my card limited?" I asked, keeping my voice smooth as glass. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did as a boy when he'd broken something. "Marissa thought it would be safer," he said, and then he added, "You've been tired lately." Tired, I thought, or inconvenient, and I swallowed my anger because I could feel it rising like heat off asphalt. The second betrayal incident was public, and it was designed to shrink me. At church, after service, Marissa chatted with the women like she'd been there for years. She laughed and said, "We're keeping Evelyn on a budget. She's like a teenager with Amazon." The women laughed politely, uncertain, and I felt my cheeks burn as if the Nevada sun had followed me inside. I watched Erin smile too, that soft, appeasing smile he used when he didn't want conflict, and something inside me went still. The third betrayal incident happened quietly, the way real theft often does. I went looking for Tom's watch one evening, the one I kept in a small velvet box, not to wear but to remember. The box was gone from the drawer, and the drawer smelled faintly of Marissa's perfume, sharp and floral. I asked Erin if he'd seen it, and he said no, too fast. Marissa appeared in the doorway and said, "Oh, that old thing? We put it somewhere safe." "Where?" I asked. She tilted her head like I was being difficult. "Evelyn, you don't need to worry about every little item. Stress isn't good for you." I stood very still, listening to the hum of my refrigerator again, the same constant sound as the day of the envelope. I opened drawers, checked closets, searched like a woman looking for her own heartbeat. When I finally found the velvet box empty inside the blue folder, my hands shook so hard I had to sit down. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was about money. This was about ownership of my space, my choices, my memories, my voice. Marissa had taken the watch because she could, and because she assumed I wouldn't fight hard enough to demand it back. I held that empty box in my lap and felt grief rise, raw and hot, not just for Tom, but for the version of my life where my home was safe. And then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote down exactly what happened, the date, the time, and who was present, on a yellow legal pad I dug from a drawer. That yellow pad became my anchor. Every incident went there, in my handwriting, clear and steady, because facts don't tremble even when people do. On Tuesday, card limit changed without consent. On Sunday, public humiliation at church. On Thursday, watch missing, velvet box empty, found inside Marissa's blue folder. I wasn't plotting yet, I was recording, and recording is what grown women do when they realize someone is rewriting their story. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, in the middle of something small. I was cooking soup, simple, tomato and basil, because it was cold and I wanted comfort, and the smell filled the house like a memory. Marissa walked in, wrinkled her nose and said, "You used too much olive oil. That's not in the budget." She said it casually like she was commenting on weather, and then she reached for my stove knob and turned the heat down. I slapped her hand away, not hard, but firm. Her eyes widened, and for a split second her mask slipped, showing something sharp underneath. Aaron rushed in like he'd been summoned by the sound of rebellion, and Marissa said, "Your mom is getting aggressive." Aggressive, because I protected my own stove. Aaron's face tightened, and he said, "Mom, please, don't make this harder." I looked at my son and saw what I hadn't wanted to name. He was choosing peace with her over respect for me. Not because he hated me, but because he was weak where she was strong, and she knew it. I turned off the stove, wiped my hands on a towel, and my voice came out quiet as sand. "This is my house," I said, "and you will not touch my food, my money, or my memories again." Marissa laughed once, small, dismissive, and said, "Evelyn, you don't even know what's in your own name anymore." The room went cold. My body stayed still, but my mind snapped to attention like a door slamming. I walked out to the entryway and I noticed the key bowl, my keys buried under theirs. I reached in, found my brass spare key, and closed my fist around it until the metal hurt. That pain felt honest, and honesty is where resolve begins. That night, my phone buzzed with an email notification, an automatic alert from my property insurance, confirming a policy update requested by Marissa Hart. The next morning, I didn't make coffee for anyone but myself. That sounds small, almost petty, but in a house where I'd been trained to perform gratitude, it was a revolution. I poured my coffee into the chipped mug, the one Marissa mocked, and I held it like a promise. I am still here. When Aaron walked into the kitchen and opened his mouth to speak, I raised my hand calm and said, "Not today." His eyes widened, and for the first time in months he looked unsure. I took my yellow legal pad and my blue folder. Yes, her blue folder, the one she treated like a throne, and I set them side by side. One was hers, glossy, controlling, filled with charts that weren't her right to make. The other was mine, plain and worn, filled with facts she couldn't charm away. I called my neighbor Diane, a retired paralegal who'd once helped a friend fight an unfair eviction. Diane answered on the second ring and said, "Evelyn, you sound like you've reached the end of your patience." "I have," I told her, and my voice surprised me with how steady it was. Diane didn't ask for gossip, she asked for details. She told me, "Start with your documents. Deed, lease history, bank statements, any emails about accounts or policies." When I hesitated, embarrassed that I might not have everything organized, she said, "Honey, they count on your shame. Don't give it to them." I stared at the key in my hand, the brass spare, and realized shame had been their favorite leash. Over the next week, my life became a quiet investigation. Monday, 08/10, I requested copies of my bank statements and printed them, circling the spending limit change and the authorized user note. Tuesday, 14/05, I found the insurance email and printed it, highlighting requested by Marissa Hart, then filed it in a new folder, my folder, not hers. Wednesday, 09/40, I took photos of the empty velvet box, the cracked mug, and the key bowl, not because objects are proof in court, but because symbolism matters when people try to gaslight you. Thursday, 16/20, I pulled the mailbox letter welcoming them as primary residents and stapled it to my pad with the date written in ink. I also did something difficult. I asked for witnesses. Not dramatic witnesses, no staged scenes, but honest people who had already seen enough to tell the truth. I spoke to 2 women from church who'd heard Marissa's teenager with Amazon joke, and I asked them to write down exactly what they heard and when. One of them, Carla, looked ashamed and said, "I didn't laugh, Evelyn. I didn't know what to do." I touched her arm and said, "Write what you know. That's doing something." Diane helped me look at the living arrangement with clear eyes. The house was mine, but months earlier, when Aaron first moved in temporarily, Marissa had insisted on making it official for mail and school records because their daughter needed a stable address. I had agreed to put them on a month-to-month occupancy agreement Diane called a courtesy lease, thinking it was harmless. Now Diane said, "Evelyn, if they're on paper, you need to end it on paper." Hearing that felt like swallowing stones, because paper is how you admit love has become a legal problem. Friday evening, my phone rang, and the number was unfamiliar. A woman introduced herself as Lila from a local property management office, and my stomach tightened at the word management. She said, "Miss Hart, we received an inquiry about transferring the lease renewal into Evelyn Hart's name. We wanted to confirm with you." My voice stayed controlled, but my hand gripped the chipped mug so hard I felt the crack beneath my thumb. "I didn't authorize that," I said, each word precise. There was a pause, and Lila's tone shifted into careful professionalism. "Thank you," she said. "We have documentation from Marissa Hart requesting changes. Some items appear incomplete." Incomplete, because my signature wasn't there, because my consent wasn't there, because their confidence had outrun legality. I asked, "Can you email me everything you received?" And she agreed, because organizations love clarity when someone finally demands it. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the blue folder Marissa loved so much, and I realized the cliff had arrived sooner than I planned. Aaron and Marissa were trying to move me out of my own life on paper, and now I had proof coming, delivered straight into my inbox, stamped with timestamps they couldn't argue with. I looked at the brass key, then at the yellow pad, then at the empty velvet box. "You don't get to steal my home," I thought, calm as stone, "and still call yourself family." At 9:12 p.m. Leela's email arrived with an attached PDF titled "Proposed Resident Change Remove Evelyn Hart." I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was sorting pieces into place like a puzzle finally showing its picture. At 6:45 a.m., I printed the PDF, and the paper felt warm from the printer, like fresh evidence. The document listed my name under Remove, and under Add, it listed Aaron and Marissa as sole primary residents. Below that was a section titled Reason, and the typed line made my stomach clench. Resident no longer able to manage independent living. I called Diane, and she drove over with her hair still damp and her jaw set. She read the page twice and said, "This isn't caregiving, this is displacement." Then she pointed to the signature line where Marissa had typed her name and written Authorized Family Representative. Diane's eyes flicked up to mine. "Do you have anything naming her as your representative?" "No," I said, because I would have remembered signing away my own adulthood. The villain's scheme unraveled in layers, each uglier than the last. They used my address to establish residency, then tried to label me incapable to justify removing me. They limited my spending to build a narrative that I was out of control, then publicly joked about it to normalize the idea. They moved my keys, monitored my purchases, and took sentimental items to see how far they could go without consequences. And when I pushed back at the stove, Marissa called me aggressive because she needed me to look unstable on record. I could have confronted them alone in my kitchen, but I wasn't interested in a private argument they could twist. Justice needs witnesses. Truth needs daylight. So I chose a place Marissa couldn't dismiss as Evelyn being emotional, the church community room, after Sunday service, where people already gathered. I asked Pastor Glenn if I could use the room for a family meeting, and I watched his expression change when he saw my seriousness. He said, "Of course," and he didn't ask questions, which was its own quiet kindness. I invited Aaron and Marissa in writing, short, polite, and firm. I invited Diane because calm authority terrifies manipulative people. I invited Carla and Denise from church because they'd heard Marissa's humiliation with their own ears. And I asked Lila, the property management representative, if she could attend briefly or provide a written statement. She agreed to provide a written statement, and she emailed it with a timestamp. That statement, printed and signed, became the second type of evidence, along with the lease change PDF. On Saturday night, I assembled my materials like a woman preparing to be believed. In my folder, the printed PDF, the insurance policy update, the mailbox primary residence letter, the bank note about the spending limit, and screenshots of texts where Marissa called me confused and combative. In my yellow legal pad, dates, times, direct quotes, and the theft of Tom's watch, documented with the empty velvet box photographed. And on my keyring, I kept the brass spare key, because that key was my reminder that home is not something you beg for. When I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had finally stopped negotiating her dignity. Sunday after service, the community room smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. Folding chairs scraped the floor as people moved around, and every sound seemed sharper because I was listening for the moment everything would change. Aaron arrived first, hands in his pockets, eyes darting like he hoped this would dissolve before it began. Marissa followed, perfectly dressed, smiling politely at everyone like she owned the room. When she saw Diane, her smile tightened, the way a mask does when it senses danger. I stood at the front with my folder and my yellow pad, and I waited until everyone settled. "I'm going to keep this simple," I said, my voice calm enough to make people lean in. Marissa laughed lightly and said, "Evelyn, are we really doing this here?" "Yes," I answered, and the quiet that followed felt like a door locking. I held up the printed PDF first. "This is a proposed resident change request," I said, and I watched Aaron's face pale as he recognized the format. "It requests that I be removed as a primary resident from my own home, citing that I'm no longer able to manage independent living." Marissa's smile flickered. "That's not what it—" I raised my hand gently. "You'll speak after I finish." Diane stepped forward and said this document was submitted by Marissa Hart as an authorized family representative. Ms. Hart has not authorized that representation. Carla inhaled sharply, and Denise whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Aaron stared at Marissa like he was seeing her for the first time without her voice in his ear. Marissa's eyes sharpened, but her tone stayed sweet. "We were trying to help. Evelyn has been struggling." I opened my folder and slid out the bank statement note. "Here's the spending limit change on my card," I said, "requested by an authorized user. I did not request it." Then I slid out the insurance email. "Here's a policy update, requested by Marissa Hart." Then I lifted the mailbox letter. "Here's mail addressed to you as primary residence at my address, before any legal transfer existed." Each page landed on the table with a soft slap, and each slap felt like a heartbeat returning. Marissa finally snapped, just enough to show the room her truth. "So what, Evelyn? You want a medal for paying bills? We've been carrying you." The room froze at the word carrying, because everyone heard what it implied, that I was a burden they deserved to profit from. I looked at Aaron and said, "Did you know she filed this document to remove me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, and his voice came out rough. "No." That was the son's realization, the moment his loyalty shifted from habit to conscience. His eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with something close, regret. Marissa turned to him fast. "Aaron, don't let them manipulate you." And Aaron, my grown son, finally did something I hadn't seen him do in years. He said, "Marissa, stop." The room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioner kick on. I took out my phone and showed the screenshots of Marissa's texts. "She's combative, she doesn't remember what she spends, we need her on allowance." I didn't gloat. I simply let the words sit there, undeniable. Then I placed the empty velvet box on the table like a small coffin. "This is where Tom's watch was," I said, and my voice softened for the first time. "It was taken. The box was found inside Marissa's blue folder." Marissa scoffed, but her hands trembled, and Denise said quietly, "Marissa, that's stealing." Pastor Glenn finally spoke, his voice steady. "Marissa, is there any explanation that matches these documents?" Marissa's face flushed, and for the first time she looked less polished and more cornered. She tried to laugh it off. This is ridiculous. She's old. She's paranoid. I interrupted her, still calm. My age is not evidence. Then I slid one final paper forward, a signed notice ending the month-to-month occupancy agreement, what Diane had helped me prepare, clearly stating the move-out deadline. I'm not arguing, I said. I'm informing. Erin stared at the notice like it was a weapon, and in a way it was. Marissa's voice went thin. You can't do that. I met her gaze, dignified, unshaking. I already did. Witnesses reacted in ways that still make my chest ache. Carla began to cry quietly, not for me alone, but for the ugliness of what had been happening in plain sight. Denise shook her head like she couldn't believe how close she'd been to laughing along. Pastor Glenn looked at Aaron with a gentle disappointment that was somehow harsher than anger. And Aaron, my son, stood up, turned to Marissa and said, "We're leaving, now." Marissa's eyes flashed. You're choosing her over your wife? Aaron's voice cracked. I'm choosing truth. Marissa grabbed her purse so hard the strap creaked and she hissed. This isn't over. I watched her storm out, heels striking the floor like punctuation, and I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but relief, like I'd been holding my breath for months. Aaron lingered, shoulders bowed. He looked at me and whispered, Mom, I didn't know. I didn't rush to comfort him. Comfort without accountability is just another way women carry men. I said softly, You didn't want to know. He flinched, and the flinch told me he understood. As people filed out, my phone buzzed, an alert from my credit monitoring service. New credit inquiry detected. The credit inquiry was the final thread, and when I pulled it, the whole sweater unraveled. Diane helped me request details, and the inquiry traced back to a home equity application started in my name. Not completed because my signature was missing, but started, which meant someone had tried. I filed a report, froze my credit, and documented everything because legal protection is not revenge, it's self-respect and paperwork. When Aaron saw the evidence, his face collapsed like a man realizing the house he lived in was built on lies. Marissa didn't apologize. People like her rarely do in a way that matters. She sent texts instead, sharp, blaming messages about how I was destroying the family. I didn't reply to any of them because silence can be the strongest boundary when words are only fuel. The move-out deadline stood because it wasn't emotional, it was contractual. And on the final day, I watched a moving truck take their boxes away under Nevada's sun that didn't pity anyone. The social consequences rippled faster than I expected. At church, women who once laughed politely now hugged me like they'd been waiting for permission. Pastor Glenn spoke privately to Aaron about accountability, and Aaron listened with the face of a man finally growing up. Marissa stopped showing up, and the absence of her performance felt like the room could breathe again. Public vindication isn't always applause. Sometimes it's the simple shift of people no longer doubting your sanity. The first night they were gone, I walked through my house slowly, touching things like they were newly mine. I put the brass spare key back on a hook by the door, my hook installed with my own hands. I placed the chipped mug on the counter and didn't hide it, because I was done hiding anything that proved I'd survived. Then I opened my own blue folder, the new one I bought, not Marissa's, and I slid my documents inside, organized, protected. For the first time in months, the refrigerator hum sounded normal, not like a warning. Aaron came by a week later, alone, shoulders tense, eyes red. He stood on my porch like he was afraid the threshold would reject him. I started counseling, he said, the words thick in his throat. I didn't know how much I was letting her control everything. I believed he meant it, but belief isn't a blank check. I love you, I told him, because motherhood doesn't vanish when someone disappoints you. But love doesn't mean access, I added, and I watched his face tighten with pain and acceptance. We talked for 2 hours about small moments he'd ignored, how Marissa spoke over me, how she framed concern as authority, how she used the word old like a verdict. Aaron cried once quietly, and I didn't shame him for it, because shame is where bad cycles breed. I said, You can be a good man, Aaron, but you have to choose it even when it costs you comfort. Reconciliation for us wasn't a hug and a happy ending. It was boundaries written clearly, like the lease notice had been. Aaron would visit with notice, not whenever, and finances would never again be discussed without my invitation. He agreed, not happily, but sincerely, and sincerity is the only place rebuilding can start. Marissa remained out of my life, and that wasn't cruelty, it was hygiene. Here's what I learned, and I'm going to say it plainly. When someone treats you like a child, they're not trying to protect you, they're trying to manage you. Control rarely arrives with chains. It arrives with concern, with spreadsheets, with jokes at your expense that train the room to see you as less. If you feel yourself shrinking, pay attention to that feeling. It's your dignity signaling danger. And if you can, document, because memory can be dismissed, but paper has a stubborn way of staying true. I didn't win by becoming cruel. I won by becoming clear. I stopped asking permission to be respected, and I stopped confusing family with entitlement. I used the tools adults are allowed to use: contracts, documentation, witnesses, and the courage to say, "This ends now." And when I hung that lease deadline on the truth held. Final beat. Closing and viewer prompt. Sometimes I still drink coffee from that chipped mug, and my thumb finds the crack without thinking. It reminds me that being cracked doesn't mean being broken. It means you've been through pressure and stayed intact enough to hold warmth. The brass key stays on its hook, right where it belongs, because home is not a place you earn back, it's a place you protect. And if anyone listening is being put on a budget like a child, I want you to hear me. You are allowed to say no, and you are allowed to put your dignity in writing. You don't need to explode to be powerful, you just need to be undeniable. If you were in my shoes, your own family treating you like you're incapable, what would you do first? Confront them, document quietly, or get legal advice immediately? Tell me in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through love that felt like control.